A very good morning to you. It is now 6 a.m. and this is Ayoto speaking to you from a rainy Berlin. It's currently 9 degrees Celsius, feeling like 8 degrees, or around 46 degrees Fahrenheit. I've prepared for you today a very special episode. 3 months ago, in July, I interviewed Afki Saketopoulou, psychoanalyst and author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, and co-author of Gender Without Identity in New York. Through her, I came across Professor Lara and Stephen Sheehi, who have co-written Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. The book sat on my desk, staring at me for 2 months before I dared to read it. The book is heavily influenced by Frantz Fanon, as Sheehi and Sheehi document stories of Palestinian clinicians in relation to settler colonialism and violence. I noticed my aversion to the book at first. What did I know about Palestine? And what do I know about the Middle East? About Israel? I felt way over my head, but the book remained there, staring at me. I returned to reading dead but safe authors like Frantz Fanon, Chinua Achebe, and James Baldwin. Stories of past struggles, theories of revolution, distant and remote. But finally, I took the plunge. I finished the book and reached out to the two professors and arranged an interview. And I was in for a shock. Because it was something that I innately knew and feared, but have been pushing away. It was a realization that this wasn't something remote and foreign. I knew and understood what the stakes were. I couldn't push back my denial of the colonial reality anymore. I understood all too well the stories from the book. The following interview you're about to hear was recorded on October 6th, the afternoon before the historical October 7th. It was the day before the cutting of water and electricity, the night before the carpet bombings, the night before the genocide. Since this interview, I've been reading, learning, listening, shouting, and crying. This book and this interview has been a lesson I will never forget. Since that day, and since I started to speak and post about Palestine and Gaza, I've received threats and harassment. One particular threat told me that I've never been to the Middle East. Untrue. And you're neither Jew nor Muslim. True. But both of these are assumptions and thought fallacies that attempt to claim exclusivity and shut people off from further discussion and action. Firstly, the "you've never been to the Middle East" argument is nothing more than experience fallacy and cultural relativism. To argue that someone's lack of direct experience in a particular region makes one opinion or argument invalid. This fallacy of argument from experience claims exclusivity. It stifles debate and limits diversity of perspectives. It dismisses expertise. It implies that academic knowledge or research is less valuable than personal experience. It privileges exclusivity, renders knowledge inaccessible, and claims that only those of a certain region will ever have rights to knowledge. And who are we protecting precisely? The problem with the argument from experience fallacy is that it repels evidence, denies empathy, and reduces diversity. It cuts off critical thinking and promotes an authoritarian mindset. And who appoints the thought leader? Sure, it might be handy when you have a leader that serves only your interest. But your oligarchs are loyal to no one but themselves. In response to "you're neither Jew nor Muslim," it is a logical fallacy of relative privation or appeal towards problems. Today, this tactic is being used to silence international community to remove assistance to the Palestinians for a problem that Western nations have created. It is not only a fantasy, but propaganda to insist that we live in a disconnected world. It is immature and dangerous to insist on this fantasy of independence. Through this function, we alienate ourselves from one another and allow for modern colonialism. We turn a blind eye to dirty secrets. We pay to look away. We have offshored our problems, our guilt to mercenaries and oligarchs, and our dirty work to the untouchables. How much longer can we afford to disparage ourselves from guilt? Another claim from so-called leftists, or rather closeted Zionists, claims they accept the accusations. Still, the suffering and deaths of Israelis call for the total dismissal of the annihilation of Gaza. They would say, now is not the time. So have we pedestalized a group of people over another to the point that the emotional value of certain people is above genocide? The appeal to emotion has never been appropriate precisely because the privileging of one's group emotion over another, as we see today, has brought us back to facing yet another moment of extinction of entire peoples. So, if not now, then when? It is fighting for silence and to cut people from participating in an issue that stifles empathy and creates division, reducing support for those in need. It ignores preventable issues. As we have witnessed, Israel has weaponized Western guilt to justify horrendous war crimes. It is a symbiotic and parasitic relationship, for the West has also weaponized Israel and their feelings to further Western imperialism in the area. This promotes inaction to further human suffering that deserves attention. It is a tactic of reducing accountability and denying responsibility. So the question comes to what kind of society we advocate for. The neoliberal plea for false universality, while actively excluding those who deem unfit for this universality, is a system that sits on cruelty. It is inhumane. It is unfair and prioritizes the emotions of a minority while dehumanizing the experience of the majority, revealing the structural racism that is powering modern imperialism. I may not be a Jew nor a Muslim, and I have never stepped foot in Gaza, nor Israel, but then neither apartheid South Africa, nor the antebellum South of the United States, nor the Atlantic slave ships. But I do know that I do not condone a world where genocide is acceptable. I do not condone a world where we bomb hospitals. I do not condone a world where we put humans in cages. I do not need to be a Muslim or a Jew or step foot in the Middle East to understand the gravity of the situation. It is my moral duty that I stand with the oppressed. I stand with the occupied. But something greater is at risk here. Can we afford tribalism in a world where sides not only willing to sacrifice millions or perhaps billions of lives, but with a nuclear holocaust which is enough to wipe out all existence as we know it? It is precisely because I am not a Muslim or Jew that I'm taking a stance, a dangerous stance. Just as with love, a love for humanity, I'm not interested in tribalism. The contrasting chants are poignant in this case here. It is not about whether to stand with or against Israel. It is about free Palestine, just as Black Lives Matter is not an exclusive plea, but a reminder of the existing hegemony where Black lives have not mattered, just like Palestine has not been free. The call to action is not to stand with Palestine and exclusivize against Israel or Jews, but rather a call for humanity. That is why it resonates with so many people around the world. At this precise point, people who are not Muslim, Jewish, or in the Middle East, but are oppressed, understand the need to stand for freedom, to stand for liberty. Free Palestine is a call against corruption, a call to ceasefire, a call to end imperialism, to end apartheid, to end slavery. It is a call for humanity and dignity for all.
Yesterday we saw again targeted attacks against civilian infrastructure, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating. With the winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such.
Started out so small, we drank and then we talked.
These are not refugees from Syria. That, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with...
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. This is Europe.
I love to use the expression, these are prosperous middle class people. These are not
This is
obviously
Europe.
refugees trying to get away from.
This is Europe.
They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has
This is Europe.
conflict raging for decades.
This is
is a
Europe.
relatively civilized,
This is Europe.
relatively European,
Got to know
choose
me,
those
I
words
got to
carefully
know
too.
her, and suddenly it's war. Then peace, so on and on. It's getting to me, I'm getting to her. Here's what I've been thinking, here's what I would do. When two people are sinking, you should get them out the pool. Here's what I've been thinking, I don't know what else to do.
is a day in my life, We're at War Edition. After hearing that there was a major lack of gluten-free, celiac-safe food at army bases across the country, we got together with a gluten-free bakery in Jerusalem to make sure those soldiers got fed. On our way to the bakery, the city of Jerusalem felt eerie and empty.
This is Europe.
Breads, cookies, and cakes to deliver across the country to different soldiers thanks to volunteers who offered to try for us. We quickly understood that we were running out of flour and that we would need to find more and lots of it if we were going to be able to continue to bake. Even the largest supermarket in Jerusalem had no gluten-free flour on its shelves, but thankfully they allowed us to go into the machzan and we found what we needed. We were able to continue our work for the day, but we knew that we wouldn't be able to get through the next without a lot more flour. We finished packaging up all of the bags for the night and we decided to call it a day so that we could have enough energy to do it all again next. I'm so incredibly grateful that Shar was willing to donate 50 kilos of flour and get it to us within a day so that we could continue baking for the soldiers. Thanks to your donations, we've gotten to over 400 soldiers, and we will continue baking for as long as is necessary.
And we stand with the Palestinians, and we stand with them. And they try and change the narrative because you own the narrative. This is your problem. You own the narrative. You own the United Nations. You own Hollywood. You own all these mouthpieces. Where are our voices? Our voices need to be heard as well. We've been watching your channel, and instead of mourning our deaths, instead of mourning these Palestinian children, we've been
genocide supporters! You are not welcome here! Genocide supporters! Fuck CNN! Fuck CNN! Fuck CNN! Fuck...
In real time, as we mentioned earlier. Did you just spill your coffee?
I spilled my coffee.
It's okay. Normally, coffee is supposed to wake us up during our early mornings. Yeah. This time, in our 6 a.m. hour, coffee was the enemy.
Culture. Well, don't put your hands on someone, douchebag.
We have a lot to talk about.
Okay, so I just want to say, first off, I feel so overwhelmed because, well, I also finished reading Gloria Vecker's White Innocence.
Yeah.
And then I'm halfway through the book, The Muslims Are Coming. And I'm trying to, and then I'm also like, who am I kidding myself? I'm stop cosplaying being a journalist. I just love talking about this. And that's why I'm reaching out to you guys and having a conversation. And I'm thinking like, okay, like, yeah, like try to be a bit more neutral. But I was like, I was going through the book and it really roused me up in terms of just like the amount of absurdity in which one has to confront whilst being, quote unquote, being neutral.
Right.
Yes.
And there's a caretaking that is necessary. Just to back up, I recently was invited to speak on a panel. There's a small gathering in a local club in Berlin. It was on the day of German Unification Day. And they want to talk about what does it mean to be German. So I was like, okay, well, this is going to be interesting and exciting. And people would start spouting like in a very neutral, normal kind of way of essentially extremely white supremacist rhetoric about the disappearance of the German language, the disappearance. I was like, oh my God, we're going to just start casually talking about white replacement theory.
Right, exactly.
Like so casual.
Right.
And so I'm thinking like, and then at the same time, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's not going to help if you start yelling back at them like, yeah, okay, good.
No, because then you're the aggressor, right?
Yeah, then I'm the aggressor, but I'm thinking like, wow. So that's why I kind of want to start with right off the bat cancellations and these theories and like how do we talk about it without like, for me, I get this like feeling of rage and madness, but at the same time, how do we deal with these things? And like, because you guys been through so much with the release of your book.
Right.
How do you deal with the rage of knowing the truth?
Well, I think so wonderful in this world, like these sorts of spaces are exactly what we need because I feel like they're also reality testing spaces. They're spaces where we can come together and understand that we have a political alignment towards the world we want to see or live in, and they're not the same. Sometimes the right wing are like, yeah, you're trying to make carbon copies of yourself, and it's like that's your limited creativity. But what is true is that in a world that is more and more hell-bent on collapsing spaces of breathing, of camaraderie, of solidarity, these spaces become really important. And these spaces meaning even just connecting over social media, setting this conversation up, being engaged in this conversation, and community building in defiance of borders. We're not in the same place, but if we're oriented towards a world that we want to see that's free of injustices and domination and exploitation, then why wouldn't we be having a conversation? I start there because I think that, for me, is the space of how do you deal with these conversations about cancellation, about neutrality and its crypto-fascist identification. And this might go back to the book, is that anger is life-sustaining. It's truly life-sustaining, and it's telling that any time we express anger about an injustice or something we feel viscerally, we know in every iota of our being that something unjust is happening to us, to our siblings, to our friends, that anger is the first thing to be negotiated to get out of the room. That's telling for me, that it's a precondition to being in a room of quote unquote civilized people. The first thing that must leave is your anger.
I want to add to it, but like, number one is anger always is racialized. When we really know what's happening in some place like Germany in particular is white anger. That actually defines American politics at this time, white anger. That's what defines in many ways French politics. So one might ask then, okay, what's the difference then between what Lara said and white anger? Then is white anger valid? What I would say is that anger is something that's telling us something is happening. And when we dig deeper down, and this goes to your point of neutrality, is what is speakable and what is not speakable. The white anger that we hear is white rage that we have heard for 300 years about savagery, about incivility, about whatever. But the anger that other people speak, which speaks of actual structural violence against them, is seen to be inappropriate. So what anger is acceptable, what is legible as valid, or what is used, or again, how is like white supremacist anger, white anger, or white rage melted into to hide black and brown rage. These aren't coincidental. These are structural issues. In Germany, they're very self-congratulatory about who they are and their quote-unquote progress post-genocide. But it's really funny to realize what modes of anger are acceptable and what aren't, what modes of neutrality are enforced and to what ends. So, for example, one can't speak against the Holocaust, nor should they, mind you, because it's an undeniable empirical reality and part of German history, but you can't speak of the Palestinian struggle. You can't speak of the way the Palestinians are oppressed. So there's really not neutrality.
It can be sold that way. But I'm just struck by, you said, you heard it, you're attuned to it. You recognize that what's being said is not neutral, that it's not neutral in as much as it actually has a historical meaning, and the Great Replacement Theory, you realize wait a second, it wasn't hard for you to go there. And I think what happens in these spaces, especially when neutrality is insisted upon, is there's also an expectation that we excise social, historical, and material reality to sit there and just take what's being said. It's the only way you could actually sit there and not feel something, right? The expectation of us in our invitation into humanity is to excise all the affective and literal memories of what that statement means. And that's why I think, whether it's on listservs or any one of these things, the things that people say with viciousness, but because they say dear and say kindly at the end, we're supposed to be like, oh, this was nice.
The invitation to humanity that is conditional is such a reminder of the asymmetry of violence, the asymmetry of who needs to maintain peace, maintain the discomfort of those who are actively, historically continuing an asymmetry of violence. I was just thinking back at this talk that I was at. The most vocal were no doubt, as trendy as it is to hate on white Germans, men, so forth, it's also impossible to ignore the fact that, sure enough, it was the very vocal white German men that would spout very undeveloped thoughts that were just so aggravating. And then there were the other, let's say, centrist characters who will say, okay, well, it's important that we have a quote-unquote diverse dialogue. All the time I'm thinking, this is not really diverse, actually. And then, sure enough, there were people there I did notice that did not speak up and were not the usual white male middle age. And I spoke to them afterwards, and one of them said, I wanted to say something. This person was a German but racialized subject. They said, I wanted to say something, but I was shaking with rage. And yet the person was not able to speak up, and understandably so. So this is what I also got from the book, from Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, that there are these stories that are untold. And then when it is told, there's a Bejahung, affirming negation. It's like, yes, 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 but. And that continually gets swept under the carpet. And then to be accused of, well, you're not wanting to have a dialogue because you're so aggressive and angry. So I'm sure from what I've observed with some of the previous kind of total shitstorm, either on Twitter or with the George Washington University situation, perhaps even your personal lives, but like, what do you do in these situations? What are your kind of day-to-day thoughts and strategies on that?
After toast. After toast and coffee.
Toast and coffee. Wow. You know, it's funny. You say it and I feel it, right? So it's real. And I feel compelled actually to join you in that moment and to say, you notice that person and you talk to them and they were able to say to you. And I think this is not me just sort of speaking to a sibling and saying, right on, that's what solidarity is attuning to people in the room, that not because they can't speak, but because there's no room for them to, whether literally no room made for them, or also because they understand the price that comes with speaking. And
speaking angrily.
Right, speaking angrily, even though it's justified. I say that because I think that is one of the things that I do, is connect with people and reality I mean this, because these systems, whether it's whiteness or settler colonialism, conscript us and entice us and seduce us into identifying with them in particular ways where parts of ourselves fundamentally have to be compromised just to exist. And that's what dialogue initiatives are. They're a foreclosed loop that is talked about under the guise of potential movement. And that potential movement can only happen if you, uncivilized, savage human, can actually understand what we're doing here. And that reason really will prevail. And if we just come together and talk, that's going to fix everything. Never mind the fact that I can talk all day and people have been talking, right? So there's already a lie that's being told at that moment of interaction. There's an assumption that is the starting point of that ask of dialogue that assumes that this has not happened before. And that also assumes that part of that dialogue necessitates that I cut off something very important, whether that's anger, whether that's my identity, my claim to self-determination, whatever it is. That talking to people, that attuning to the parts of when they can and can't talk, that helps me stay clear on what's happening structurally, not just individually. Because by and large, I had this conversation with my students the other day, is like, I take it very seriously to retain my humanity and to not have these structures of violence wear away my humanity. And what my humanity means is that I am compelled to see the human in every interaction. And that might make me want to have a dialogue. So that I never shame myself or others about the impulse to have a dialogue. However, that invitation to interact on an individual level is also the way that structures continue to perpetuate violence. Because that one interaction, great, I feel good, they feel good. Actually, I don't usually feel good. I feel empty and disgusted with myself and feel used and violated most of the time. But they feel very good. So there's something happening there. But it does nothing to move structures. We can have this conversation all day long and you can feel good about yourself. And in the end, what are we doing to shift structures? So I think that is what I remind myself of. I retain my humanity, and then I remember this is not about the individual encounter. It's about something larger. One of the most life-affirming and sustaining things I've been engaging in, as you said, as a counter to that, is refusing. And psychic refusals are incredibly important. And I will tell you, nothing makes people angrier. And you see it immediately. So the nice person who just wants the dialogue in 5 seconds becomes the most angry, indignant, violent person, which makes you question, like, if you could move that quickly, was this a good faith olive branch for dialogue to begin with? But really, the refusal comes in many ways. Is also refusing not to speak to what is happening, refusing to join in the secret keeping, in the complicity, and the politics of politeness that have always been used to enact violence on racialized and gendered and disabled subjects and class subjects. Again, when I say refusal, that can mean very abstract things of like refusing, let's say, normalization with the apartheid state of Israel. Or it can mean very real things of like, I will not join in this relational ask that fundamentally is violent. And I will tell you why I'm not joining. And that's the piece where, I mean, you said you read Gloria Wecker. That's where people go haywire.
Yeah, they get aggressive real fast.
They do not like that.
The invitation to dialogue is always an invitation to seek futures for the oppressor.
National liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people. Whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization is a historical process. It cannot be understood, it cannot become clear to itself, except by the movements which give it historical form and content. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding.
Fanon teaches us that. And invitations for dialogue always come out of a moment of crisis. It never comes out of the moment of security for the oppressor. It comes from the moment that they see, as Fanon said, the writing on the wall. And so you said something about hearing that your stories aren't told, and then kind of when they're told, they're not heard. What happens when you live in a world where all is actually known? That it's not that whether it's cis heteronormative dominance, whether it's racial dominance, whether it's colonialism, it's not that we don't know the suffering of the marginalized. We know it, but it has to be repeated, and that's what dialogue does. It invites us to come in and repeat, rehearse, domesticate, where the oppressor at best can say, I didn't know your collar was so tight. No kink shaming, no BDS shaming. I'm talking about really non-consensual servitude here. And that's what they seek to do. Dialogue seeks a certain form of consensual servitude that is really non-consensual. And you ask, how do we guide ourselves through the day? It's also remembering, we're speaking all very theoretically. This is actually not, we're speaking in the abstract, but it's actually very concrete when it comes to Palestine. The Palestinians have been dialoguing for 30 years with Oslo. And it was this move to dialogue has only been a mode to actually extend and continue their dispossession. This search for the two-state solution, when actually it has been used to entrench Israeli hold of the West Bank and entrench the hegemony against Palestinians within the state now known as Israel. So it is also being connected very much with the reality of history, a reality of the material conditions that we live today. Just like that anger comes out, and that person was angry because they understood when that white male, again, doesn't need to present fully developed thought. People in authority, or people with proximity to authority, or people who are collaborators, they don't need to present fully developed thoughts because what they think is fact. But here that, sibling is welling up with anger because he knows he is living an experience that's very much different. An experience that we all know that he doesn't have to tell, but he has to repeat it over and over again to be accepted into this regime of reality, which is really reality bending.
The kind of third position, this invisibility. One was, I'm not actually having in-depth debate or discussion at an issue. And this is where you said, it's not that it's unknown. And I think so much of the processing power is having to be on the layer of repressing what is already absolutely clear. But then I realized, to negate, you have to know that to negate. It's not a position of shock or ignorance. It's or aggressive ignorance. I really appreciate the reminder of a psychic refusal, because what does one do? And then to further that discussion, I want to bring it back to Palestine and extend that view, not on either Israel or Palestine, but like on the invisible hegemony, the so-called normal world. What is the difference between the Oslo Accords and the Clinton reconciliation periods? What are your views on that invisible part of the so-called neutral bystanders?
Well, I guess I'll start with the end part first, which is, I think, again, it's funny you said something about the sort of hegemony of it's called normalcy. And it's really important for us always to note that we all know that, quote unquote, the normal is full with contradictions and it's heterogeneous. So it can hold, let's say, some difference. So with that in mind, the way in which we think of, let's say, the post-Oslo era is to think that here we are, the Palestinians, they agreed to lay down their weapons with an understanding of having their own Palestinian state, which would only exist on 30% of historic Palestine, which was effectively accepted by the PLO. It's really important to understand, if we think about Clinton, what is most important about the Clinton era is there's something called the Clinton parameters. And these are the parameters that basically everyone knows what would be the parameters of an official establishment of a Palestinian state and normalization between the Palestinians and Israelis and subsequently the Arab world. They're called Clinton parameters because they were agreed upon in 2000 when Clinton's leaving office. It's just a matter of tweaking here and there. But that shows you that Israel had no real intention to make an agreement that would grant Palestinian independence. Now, autonomy is another issue. They would be more than happy, and this is where we're going now, and this is very likely the scenario that will be coming over the next several weeks, is that we will be told that the Palestinians have their new state, but it won't be a state. They won't have control of their borders. They won't have control of the resources, including water underneath the land in which they live. They will not have control of the air, which is the case now. They will not have free access to go where they want, when they want. And it will be called independence, but it's really just a Bantustan. And so it's funny that we think about moments in history as lost opportunities, but it's really important to understand that those victories, those opportunities were actually still ways of just institutionalizing settler colonialism and the subjugation of the Palestinians. They were willing, or many of the leadership, the PLO was willing to make that compromise. But it speaks to how bad things are when you have this horrible regime, this Palestinian Authority, which are basically it's a regime of collaborators with Israel, and still a Palestinian state cannot be established, even with Israeli allies as its head. That speaks to something. And if we want to take it out of the context of Palestine, it just also speaks to the way in which power works. It speaks to what one could call the coloniality of power, how we build in our structures within Western developed societies where you think about diversity and all these sorts of things. But in fact, what are these states, what are these societies actually willing to change structurally in order to remediate some forms of oppression? And it's marginal.
And we will be told that that is from the generosity of the oppressors. And I say this and we can laugh and we should laugh, but when we think about it, it's like the magnanimity of the oppressors to compromise on their vision to allow for this. But if we're to sort of extrapolate that, it's sort of like saying how generous the carceral system is because it feeds incarcerated folks. But the affective plane, it really plays on that. And I think it's for us to really tune into and be careful when we start thinking along those lines and wondering, but this is generous, start those compromises in our mind, because that for me is when settler colonial logics have been internalized, because that is not the starting point. The premise is not that. There is no generosity under oppression. There is no generosity under settler colonialism, because the structure is already placed in position to continue dispossession and displacement and to regularize that, so much so that we can sit there and be like, I forgot that the structure itself was a rotten one. And if we find, one part of a fruit that's somewhat not rotten, that we're supposed to be celebrating that. It's also refusing the premise upon which these arguments even begin, which is the state of affairs in general. When we talk about Palestine, whether that's in the media or the starting positions are not the actual starting positions of these conversations. The starting position has to be, this is a settler colonial condition. And from there, we can understand everything that is happening. What are the conditions that can create the possibility of not knowing? That somebody can truly believe of themselves that they don't know. Because I'm not about to get into an argument with somebody who says, I actually didn't know, I'm ignorant. That's not helpful. But what I would say instead is, okay, I will take that at face value and then ask, what are the conditions that came to be where you don't know, where you can't know, or where you can't sustain your knowing? Because we also know that people come in and out of knowing. And that is what I mean about the starting position, is that settler colonial logics work specifically on those psychic fault lines. It is in the best interest of settler colonialism for people to forget, to have amnesia. That's how we walk around in the United States and people call things by their state names and forget that it's a settler colonial society that is actively in real time continuing to dispossess and genocide indigenous peoples. And then we start to talk about it in terms of the past, like all these regularized means of even conversation are mechanics of settler colonialism. And that is, I think, why it would be like an inversion of like, we have to always start there.
Colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence.
What would you say to the idea of radicalization at the cost of the complete dissolution of quote-unquote civilized society?
Anarchy! Yeah, but it's funny because when you say that, it draws the fantasy of what tells us the purge. That fantasy comes out of a capitalist, racialized, settler colonial worldview. It's you who've kept everyone down, that when you take off the shackles, take off that non-consensual collar, that we're all going to come back and start killing it. We're all going to turn into Nat Turner, which Nat Turner should have done what he should have done now. That everyone just is going to go get theirs, just going to be anarchy, right? To put it crudely, that's a white fantasy. This is not to say that non-white folks don't have it, but it's a fantasy that emerges out of white supremacy and settler colonialism and racial capitalism and cis heteronormativity and patriarchy. Why? Because they fundamentally know the violence they have inflicted on people. To them, it's logical. Violence is logical. And they understand, talk about the known and the unknown. They know. Colonialism would never say, oh, we didn't do this or not. They just said, with all that violence, we also brought schools and roads. There's a knowledge, that fantasy, that radicalization means anarchy. I'm an anarchist, by the way, is one that comes out of the knowledge in racial capitalism, cis heteronormativity, patriarchy, that they live lives of violence. We live in worlds of violence. We live in worlds of ecocide. We know that. Where I would think, quote-unquote, radicalization, which is now has Muslim tinges to it, because when we don't think of radicalization, we don't think of the white nationalists who are the people being radicalized. I think of ways in which we come together collectively and forge together new worlds. And Lara was talking about the unknown. It's not about, decoloniality is not going back and wearing my dishdeshi or my kente cloth or whatever, and not to say that's a bad thing, but it's not to go back to the lives of our great-great-grandparents. It's to say the ways of violence in which we know, the ways of violence which can fantasize the purge, are ways in which we need to abandon and through there go through, as Arundhati Roy says, go through a portal to, speaking about known and unknown, to an unknown world that we can forge together collectively through collaboration. I mean, it's not messy, it's going to be messy. Community congeals and can also split, but it's also these processes of how do we go. And also in the rear view mirror, we also have to track the counter-revolution. Because every time the revolution happens, the counter-revolution, because it has its levers on power, invariably come back twice as strong and with twice as much of overt violence.
I think this is what sisters, from Taylor or Gail Lewis might also lead us to, is like daring to live otherwise, or go through that portal when you don't know what's on the other side. With the idea that in community, you're always working in what's emerging, right? We understand. I will say this concretely, it's not a suicidal jump. It's recognizing that to imagine otherwise, there is a movement that has to happen. And I think part of this idea of thinking about end of civilization, so on and so forth, is like, I think, number one, the lack of imagination of fascists is remarkable. And that is because I think it's steeped in violence, because imagination is controlled and disciplined, and that's a way you also normalize that violence because it's just what it is and there's no other way of being. We can resist, part of the refusal might be to resist that projection or that projective identification and say, I refuse to live in this world. And if this is your civilization, yes, of course we should end it. That doesn't mean ending humans. That means ending your so-called civilization that, for example, a child in a school in the United States can get a stamp put on his hand because he doesn't have enough money to eat. It is ending poverty. It is ending the perverse aspect of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of empty homes when unhoused people can't breathe because of fires, because of what we've done to this world. That the myth of this great civilization is something we need to break. What is civilized about that? There is nothing that I want to hold on to from that version of civilization. And that's the imagining otherwise, is that this can't be it. And if that's what we're talking about, whether it's a class suicide, I've been pushed up against about saying our field needs to suicide. And what I'm talking about here is like, what are the parts of ourselves that we must slough off to bring this new world into being? And if that means identifications with race and be a race trader every day, if it's our identifications with class and be a class trader every day, or identifications with any one of the number of things that sustain the violence of the world, the inequities of the world that are racialized, then why wouldn't we all say, yes, we must suicide that? We should all join in and say, yes, because in that death, there is something else that comes to life. And that life should be sustainable rather than this death march we're all on right now.
Right-wingers are now say that's going to be the next tweet.
Yeah, exactly.
Lara calls for a human mass suicide.
Yes,
they're not going to say Lara
heard it here first.
Exactly. Yes. Lara doesn't call for new worlds where where everyone can live life exactly, where there is no racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or this patriarchy.
Right. And that's the bad faith of it. And we know this. And if we didn't understand the bad faith and we didn't understand that there is actually a knowledge that is retained, whether it's by fascists or by any of these, the billions of dollars that are spent to shut us up, to suppress boycott, divestment, and sanctions, to infiltrate campuses and intimidate and harass students on UIC campus in the United States, where Palestinian students are not allowed into a conversation and were actually barred from going there because their last names looked Arab or Muslim. Why would any of this be? You're not fooling me, you're telling on yourself. So this lie that you don't know, none of this would be happening if you truly didn't know.
And again, it's not the Palestine exception, it's the Palestine example, which is because same thing, Black Lives Matter, infiltrated by the FBI, spied on as a black extremist identity group. Same thing that they do for water protectors, Cop City, people, environmental justice. This actually speaks to exactly what you're saying.
A lot of this reminds me a lot of Eschatonian projection of a Christian right-wing conservative mindset, or the idealization of a linear timeline, Joseph Campbell, hero's journey type thing. And I spoke with a friend and he says, the end of times depends on who you talk to, has already happened over and over. It's just situated at a different time frame. The whole time when you speak of, let's say, a call to collective mass suicide or something, and then the people will hear, oh my God, she's putting together the end of the world, so forth. And it's just so misplaced. And do you think this is also, I mean, there is the famous tweet from you, Lara, that the right wing seems to continuously remind everybody of. What was it? The thing about Hamas, and that if you don't understand that Hamas is not a terrorist group, there's no hope for you. What was?
Yeah. If you still think Hamas is the problem here, there's no hope for your soul ever, or something like that.
There seems to be a focus on Lara and kind of personal attack, and I think that was also what happened even at GW with regards to all the scandals and everything. Mm-hmm. And I heard you talking about the brown paperback test, about that and the history of that. Do you think that this is blatantly obvious, the will to destroy an individual, and also based in sexist, racist rhetoric? And Stephen, have you noticed a kind of like a difference in terms of treatment, in terms of as an individual since the release of the book?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask if I feel bad that I'm being more ignored by the right wing than Lara.
That was what I was implying.
Is that what it was? It was like,
I was
why? Aren't you good enough? I'm not good enough for you? God damn it. So
let me first to answer you about the way that racism, sexism, and Islamophobia and anti-Arabness is mobilized is I want to set the record straight about that tweet. Is that the reason why I can't remember it is because by and large, this is not a controversial statement, and it is understood in academia in terms of what I actually meant by it, because what is always parsed by the right wing, because they deal in salaciousness, very salacious in a world that already has Islamophobia and thinks that Hamas are the ultra villain in the world or whatever it is. It's very primed for that to be the sexiest thing you could find, this Arab, pro-Palestinian, anarchist clinician. What's ignored in that, and this is what I would say, why I don't give it much attention, is because the bad faith is so blatant that I'm shocked that some people can't even see it. Because what's not attended to is that I made that statement in the context of Gaza being pummeled, being collectively punished by the military might of an apartheid settler colonial state that is supported by the biggest military and power in the world, the settler colonial state of the United States. In what universe can we think of, unless you are truly Islamophobic and hate Muslims and think they are that much more evil, that Hamas can come up against what otherwise is the most strong army in the world that can take anything, including small little kids, by the way. They come up against kids so well. That's what I mean, is like that when I say what are our starting points, that's the comment I was making. I have no patience anymore in this day and age for people who make pedantic comments and refuse to engage any power analysis. And I refuse to be pulled into this Islamophobic, racist rhetoric that asks me to denounce Hamas as a beginning point. That's not for me to do. What I am here to say is that if we are to sustain a good faith power analysis, there's nobody in the world that would say Hamas is the one that's enacting all the suffering in Gaza. That is a serious psychic disavowal. There's something fundamentally wrong with that position. That was my point. And that's what I mean. It was like a flippant comment that I didn't think twice about. Number one, because this is what I mean by and large accepted in academia. Like, we understand who has power here and who doesn't. But the fear of Muslims is so pointed. That is the only context under which we can forget, going back to not knowing and forgetting and not being able to access reality about power. It's in that moment that people forget all about that and then can deploy that tweet as a function of who I am and what has been really said, which is quite dangerous and disgustingly racist against Arabs and anybody who fights for Palestine, is that in and of itself is proof about my fundamental dangerousness towards Jews and Jewish students. I'm sorry, I'm going to say the bad word here. That is psychotic. That is what we understand as being psychotic processing. Under any other condition, we can understand the lapses of judgment. So I'm left with two things. Are you lapsing that much judgment because your ideology is so entrenched? Or are you willfully trying to harm me? And that's where we're at right now. And I can see clearly the people who are trying to harm me. within the field and outside the field. If you're a right-wing fanatic, why wouldn't you try to harm somebody who's outspoken about their positions and who's a known leftist? And then there's I think the more quote-unquote innocent, this is what in our book we talk about psychoanalytic innocence. There's a way in which liberals will all of a sudden let go of all their values of liberal humanism and due processing and side with fascist discourse because of their fear of mistakes. And that's the ideology part of things. So I'm thinking both exist, especially when that tweet itself. I'm actually happy you brought that up because that tweet is so glaring in the way that it's been used to attack me. So glaring in its anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiment. And then, of course, the sexism that's overloaded onto that about how I'm aggressive, how I'm, we know that women of color are penalized at a higher rate and much more punitive for them to speak up, both in terms of the things they actually bring that are of merit, and then sometimes when they do nothing, as in my case, when the entire thing is fabricated, you still get punished at a higher rate than let's go back to the white German man that, just talks out of nowhere and says nonsense. They're not going to get punished for that.
You asked about me, number one, being growing up in the United States as a racialized subject, as an Arab. These words are always, thrown at you: terrorist, Hamas supporter, Ayatollah, all these sorts of things. Actually, it was specifically said that I'm a Hamas member, which is, I did not know that Hamas is accepting applications from Maronite Lebanese at this moment. So it was it was a shock. I have to go back and see if they changed the rules for application. But I think on the other side of this, the question is, or maybe not the question, but the realization is, this is the nomenclature of empire and racial capitalism. Israel does not control the United States like anti-Semites say. Israel is a settler colonial power. It functions along settler colonial modes of power. And that comes out of particular structures that other settler colonial powers also operate on. And so there's a nomenclature of empire and racial capitalism that justifies and legitimizes settler colonialism and hides it as something not settler colonialism, but just sort of a natural political development. I mean, United States, the university where I work is next to colonial Williamsburg, and that's not an insult. We call it the colonial period and the colonial this and colonial style. So that kind of speaks to your point also about apocalypse. Colonialism was an apocalypse for people. The Holocaust was an apocalypse. We're living in post-apocalypse Germany. But this is what Lara was saying when you were saying, and Lara made me think of Césaire, thinking about this is barbarism, it's not civilization. It's like the language in which Lara walks into. We're not saying that somehow, I don't think it ever happens, that there's not a little cadre of Zionists sitting in McLean, Virginia, figuring out who's out going to be the next target. The prevalence of language or structures out there that you can easily deploy language and easily vilify someone when they appear on the radar. The capriciousness is precisely part of the power of that. When you say someone's a Hamas supporter, it immediately mobilizes other constituencies. It's not coincidental. I wonder, they're so sloppy. The right wing is so sloppy because they sometimes don't even need the emails, the tweets, because they're not going to agree with anything in a tweet, no matter what. But Lara is presenting a sustained critique, not an anti-Semitic tirade.
Yeah, which of course is shown in what tweets they don't highlight. They don't highlight the tweets in which I make it clear that I understand anti-Semitism as being a form of oppression and that I fight that alongside my Jewish siblings, not because I'm performative, but because if I fight for justice, that has to be a part of it. But that doesn't fit the bill. If you see my critiques of capitalism, of settler colonialism alongside these other things, and it doesn't cohere, there are contradictions in that. Why would you willfully show those contradictions or humanize me? The piece, I think, you said sexism, and I want to make this, and then maybe this is at play. You sort of asked, why has Stephen been getting the same sort of pushback? I do think this is where I would say, number one, I don't know. It's that capricious. What we do know is that at the same time with these other right-wing websites, of course, they mentioned him in there when we were at the New York conference, and there was a billboard that was driving around the conference site to harass us and harass the conference goers. Both of our faces were on there.
A very flattering picture.
Yes, flattering picture of him, a horrible one of me. I mean,
that shows you the sexism.
Did you feel included though at that time?
Yeah, I was kind of jacked in that picture.
Exactly. But what I do know, and where it sort of overlaps with gender, is that what we see in these smear campaigns also is a targeting of people who ostensibly are vulnerable. And so you see a junior colleague, an assistant professor, you make assumptions. I mean, these are all sexist. We understand that as being sexism. Like, sexism is not just like, I won't pay you as much. That's part of it. But it also is all these assumptions that come around the weakness about not being protected, about how easy of a target you are. That is what patriarchy does. It's about power. It's about accessibility in terms of causing harm. Behind the scenes, it's also much more salacious. And part of the capriciousness is just opportunism. It's opportunistic. We know that these right-wing organizations like Stand With Us, just like with reproductive rights, by the way, just like against trans issues and like being able to refuse baking a cake for gay people in the United States, is a lot of these groups look for people who are willing to give them the story, even if they are not themselves bringing any complaints to anybody. They expend a lot of money really being opportunistically predatory. And so that's where I would say the opportunism is. You exploit people who might share Zionist views, but then you take it on and do all the work for it and expend all the money and make it appear as though it represents a lot more people. This is a right-wing tactic. This is nothing new, and especially in the United States, we're seeing this a lot more.
Even here in Europe, I noticed that generally I laugh off the vehemently right-wing rhetoric and the channels. It's beyond comical. But then a lot of that gets disseminated, and then I'm constantly shocked, and maybe shocked at my own shock, that I see how it's disseminated to even, of course, it requires the academic structure to put in place these rhetoric that are the foundation. It is rooted in capitalism, neoliberalism, imperialism, and so forth. But that's my own naivety with regards to the psychoanalytic innocence, but also about the imperialism of healing. This idea that we can sell you something, that we can really reach a point, that we can really work towards an idea of healing at all costs, if only we were to get rid of you guys.
Right? That's right. Yes. Disappear the Arab.
Do you think your position as well, being the president-elect of the Society of Psychoanalysis, has something to do with that, as in terms of like as a projected emblem of martyrdom or something, or like that you become this target? Has that? Yeah. Have you experienced that?
So I was president-elect when some of the stuff at GW started. I've been the president this year. I will be the president next year. I think there's something to be said about that. And I think, my good friend and colleague and comrade Carter is writing a book right now about the way that fascism is showing up in psychoanalysis and how it's at our doorstep. So what I'll say, one, is that in many ways, psychoanalysis, it's not exclusive to psychoanalysis and it's not special in that way. What I'll say is that in this moment in time, psychoanalysis was primed for this, and I'll go into it based on your question, and also being heavily courted and targeted. And already we can see right-wing organizing was already happening within psychoanalysis, that when this came, it was another opportunity to do this. And the reason why I say that is, and this is what ties into your question about, me as being the president, of course that gives me more visibility. It becomes symbolic, and Stephen has written about this before in the context of Islamophobia, where Islamophobes would make examples of people, would go after people's career, would make their life a living hell, would try to mire them and ruin their reputation, in some ways in capricious ways, because there might be other people that are more visible. Like Stephen has been more visible in his career than I have in many ways. But Stephen is also in Middle East studies and cultural history. Like this is a go around they've been through this for decades. Whereas psychoanalysis, it's new. That's what I mean by targeting of it. And you make an example out of people. Again, my friend Carter and others have analyzed, Avi Sakutu being another one of those people, of what it means when whiteness closes ranks. And this happens a lot in our field. And then also, what does it mean when ostensibly you have a quote unquote leader? For an anarchist, there's nothing more offensive than somebody saying, I'm the leader of a movement, okay? But if I have a position of leadership, what that does is create a space where a particular discourse is then normalized. C, I'm ventriloquizing now the right-wing elements and even liberals who are worried about the lack of purity of psychoanalysis anymore. And this is where, by the way, transphobes and Zionists come together around this, of like whipping up fear that this once pristine psychoanalysis is being overrun by quote unquote woke therapists and all these derogatory terms about social justice, as though the history of our field has never been involved in social justice. I mean, again, I love the truth telling that all of you understood the imperial nature of psychoanalysis, but now it's making you really upset that we're pointing that out. But they have made me out to be this charismatic leader, like almost like a sociopath, all these like dumb followers that don't know what they're doing. And again, this is the mobilization of a discourse that is actually pointing to a fear around what it is that we are actually demanding psychoanalysis does. And there are many people now that are just no longer willing to accept that any form of mental health can exist without attending to these structures that we were just talking about before. How do I, in good conscience, and even in keeping with my ethics code, understand people's suffering as being theirs alone when we understand that people can barely survive in today's world? What, they can work 3 or 4 jobs and still not make rent in certain places. That's unethical of me not to understand capitalism and the structures of racial oppression, racial capitalism, poverty, and not in a cursory way, but as central to people's suffering. And therefore, my responsibility to join in alleviating that as part of my work as a clinician, as an ethical imperative of mine, whether it's about speaking about it, not being silent about it, about admonishing us in the ways that we are complicit with people's suffering because we just don't talk about it, by the way that we're complicit in people's suffering, by the oppressive conditions that we have in our training institutes or in our doctoral programs. I take that responsibility very seriously. And so in that regard, yeah, if I'm quote unquote outspoken about that, or spokesperson as they make me, and I have a leadership position, it's much easier for them to make the point that I might have this dangerous impact on the field. Because like somebody who doesn't have a leadership position, it's harder to make that argument. What is unspoken, of course, is how many people have been bringing psychoanalysis to task for a very long time. I didn't invent this. This is where racism, sexism, and xenophobia comes in, of course, because I'm that much more of a threat in their eyes. They're able to mobilize these racist and sexist tropes because they fundamentally see me and view me and talk about me as an interloper, as somebody who doesn't belong there, who somehow found themselves in, oh my gosh, we, invited the vampire in. How did we do that? Sometimes it's really that blatant that it's talked about. Which is like, again, going back to Europe, this is how it's spoken about. Like the disappearance of the German language. This is the version we're getting in psychoanalysis. The disappearance of psychoanalysis because these refugees have somehow found their ways on our shores.
Do you think this is a form of displacement in terms of the effects of colonialism, the effects of imperialism, the effects of pillaging of the entire world, inability to take accountability or to work on that? And then to just scapegoat people as it always has been? Do you think this is just going to increase? And from a psychoanalytic perspective, how would one go about even starting to treat subject in this position?
In the position of like colonized, you mean? Or an oppressed
of the colonizer.
Oh.
I just want to make one caveat, which is these are all obviously very passionate inducing conversations and topics and analytics. Just to say that we shouldn't exclusivize these as things, as Lars were saying. As someone who's in the academy, say in comparative literature or in history, it's the same thing is happening in many ways. And the question is, why wouldn't it happen? Because these are things that are happening in our world. Black folk in the United States came together after the murder of George Floyd in ways that were unprecedented for a while. And why would we not feel the repercussions of that in each of our fields? Issues of race and empire have structured European societies. Why would we not feel the repercussion of that in how they form our academic disciplines? So I think it's really important to just really, really focus on these things as not exceptions, but actually as structural tremors that people are pushing back. And what we always feel otherwise is how structures seek to stabilize themselves. And they try to stabilize themselves through various forms. One is explicit violence. Go after Lara, let's crush her. Two is reform. Okay, let's have dialogue. Okay, we'll have a Palestinian end for Israelis. We'll have two different events. And then the other one is also conscription. How do we conscript Black, brown, queer folk into the system to also be able to be a part of a future oppression that can really never destabilize those structures? It's the Obama effect. And as racialized subjects, conscription is always there too. And so why would this not actually work? Actually, I should say, the place that this often happens is in our professional and academic spaces, as well as in the therapy room. No, of course you're not crazy. Of course it's hard to be Black in the United States. Of course it is. What can we do? What's the sort of work we can do in this room together where we can make you a proud Black queer woman to go out into the world and be comfortable with yourself? Those forms of conscription. And how do we conscript minoritized subjects to actually become agents of stabilization?
And in that way, I think when you're discussing that, you're reminding me, I want to go back to this question. Like for a second there, I was like, how do you go about treating the colonizer? First of all, I would say, read Fanon and see what his answer is to that.
When Fanon was working as a psychiatrist in a French hospital, he started treating victims of French torture. He also started treating the torturers. And there is that appendix in Wretched of the Earth, which sort of half tells that story. Hearing the stories, examining the psyche of the torturer and the tortured, transformed him as an individual. I have no idea, and I asked Fanon twice, did you do any good to your patients? He said, je ne sais pas. I have no idea. I don't know. I said, then what happened? He said, ça me transformé. It transformed me. Because what he discovered in that relationship were 3 or 4 things. One was how injurious the relationship of domination is, both to the dominator and to the dominated, to the victim and the victimizer. The second thing he understood, and powerfully, was that race. He hadn't come to the full realization of sex about it, although he shows signs of seeing it in l'année 5e de la Révolution algérienne. But he understood that race plays a very important role in separating people artificially. And thirdly, he realized, he learned this from the Algerian victims, that when the victim stands on his feet and fights back, he's not a victim anymore.
Psychoanalysis has been treating the colonizer for its whole history. That is the center of psychoanalysis. That's what we mean when we say there's a Eurocentric psychoanalysis. Who does it center and who does it displace? So I'm much more concerned with the psychoanalysis that treats the colonized. And if that's even a possibility, what I do know is that the version that is most widely used, or I would say weaponized, that enacts violence is not one that is commensurate with the liberation of oppressed peoples. And it's an open-ended question. That's part of the emergence of it. Is there something to retool it? But the question remains the same. Is like, this has always been a treatment for the colonizers, very comfortably.
It's just ways to have the colonizer live comfortably with the asymmetrical power in which they hold. And that's why I just want to make an addendum to what Lara said, to say that when we were talking about, new worlds we want to imagine, it's cliche to say, when Black folk are free, we're all free. And that's important. But we also do have to understand that privilege needs to be ceded. And that's what people in privileged positions feel. And even white working class, what small privilege they have, which is their race privilege, that's where they're holding on to. And it's not about having everybody come into the same tent. It's about the fact of the matter is that we have to build a new structure completely. And in doing that, we have to also cede certain privileges. I, as a male, has to cede certain privileges I have as a male into this hetero patriarchy. I have to be aware of that which I carry with me and the history that I carry with me, whether I'm responsible for it or not. And I think this is the problem that psychoanalysis, this is the colonizer's place in the therapy room. Is he being addressed in that way, or is he just being told to be more comfortable in the ways he holds that asymmetrical power?
From here we refer to a case from the book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, which is presented as follows.
In this chapter, we've begun to interweave the insights of Palestinian clinicians to help us map out the fixed pieces within a collective Palestinian psychoanalytic, psychodynamic practice that shares fixed pieces that bind historic Palestine. We will see that this collective practice is unified through precisely its engagement with creating and maintaining life and life worlds, as well as political and historical realities for Palestinians. Since this collective practice is inevitably rooted in the lives of clinicians, as Palestinians themselves, we move to a powerful and illustrative vignette that gives light to the intersubjective dynamics of therapy under occupation. After meeting Yoad and Beit Anina, we continued to have conversations with her and witnessed her speak publicly and in psychoanalytic groups over subsequent years, conversations that not only increased our admiration for her critical insights and her depths of empathy. One particular case she shared with us is that of Amjad, a man in his early 30s who worked in an Israeli textile company inside the 1948 borders of the state now known as Israel. Though he had a home in the West Bank, Amjad, along with his 3 children and wife who was a homemaker, rented a house in an officially annexed village near Kalandia out of fear of losing his identity card that allowed him to live and work in Jerusalem. Amjad visited the clinic as he suffered from sensations of a lump or a ball in his throat whenever he became nervous. Amjad had undergone many medical tests to establish treatment for what he felt was a medical condition, though each medical consultation indicated that his throat was 100% normal. After a year of engaging with medical doctors with persistent concerns about the ball in his throat, one of Amjad's physicians suggested that he seek help from a psychological clinic. Amjad was initially very embarrassed in the clinical space and found difficulty speaking about himself, as well as anything beyond what he continued to feel must be a medical condition. He explained that there were days when he felt the ball in his throat was getting bigger, while other days he felt it getting smaller. Yoad asked him to share with her his reflections and observations about what sometimes made the pain increase to such a degree that he was barely able to speak. Yoad indicated that Amjad was a well-groomed young man and looked his stated age, that is, in his early 30s. He often entered her room with a shy smile and initially waited for her to start speaking. She characterized him as someone who took great care in arranging his sentences and words to make himself understandable. While Yoad did not believe Amjad had a stutter, she indicated that he would often display great difficulty producing utterances, often experiencing word-finding difficulties, and showed signs of obsessiveness in searching for correct phrasings. She reported that, as a result, early in their sessions, Amjad mumbled very short sentences, speaking in choppy words and broken phrases. She reported that he would tell her, "My words stop in my throat. They knot up and become a ball in my throat. They suffocate me when they do not come out." This manner of speech was experienced counter-transferentially as irritating to Yoad, and Amjad reflected back this irritation with himself. Yoad indicated that, in her counter-transference, she often would feel the ball move from his throat into her stomach, a knot she could not incise. Amjad's therapy with Yoad spent approximately 1.5 years of weekly sessions. She reported initially having been supervised, as are all Palestinian clinicians, working within Israeli institutions, by an Israeli Jewish psychologist. Yoad noted that while the lore of this institution was such that everyone held themselves to professional standards and believed in the fundamental premises of psychoanalytic theory and practice, she often sensed this collapse of psychic space when her Israeli supervisors, especially in the case of Amjad, tried to theorize Palestinian patients seen by Palestinian clinicians. In the case of Amjad, rather than being curious about the psychoanalytic meanings of Amjad's symptoms, the supervisor insisted that Amjad suffered from an anxiety disorder and that only medication could solve his problem. Yoad felt deeply conflicted by this assessment as she relayed her gut feeling, or what we might read as attuned clinical intuition, indicated that Amjad likely had much more to say. She feared that medicine would only circumvent and redress symptoms, potentially preemptively shutting Amjad and his exploratory process down, and foreclosing opportunities to collaboratively read the symptoms as signs of a deeper communication about his experience and being. Yoad recalled disagreeing with her supervisor openly, despite being painfully aware of the power differential and the potential implications of doing so. She reported insisting that she should continue to be curious with Amjad about what he was trying to communicate in the displacement, in the countertransferential space, and in the dyad, even if this was not explicitly articulated. This, of course, represented an alignment with the psychoanalytic tradition and technique in which she and her supervisor were trained. Despite this, her supervisor insisted on psychiatric intervention, and therefore Yoad suggested that he consult a psychiatrist, an intervention that ultimately pacified her supervisor, but which Amjad refused. Yoad reported that Amjad attended all of his sessions promptly, bringing with him a piece of paper with points that he had considered throughout the week and wanted to address with her. As their therapy progressed, Yoad would often see Amjad in the waiting room, reviewing his notes, which he used in the therapy as a springboard. Yoad noticed that Amjad went from barely speaking to exquisite detailing of his many concerns, his fatigue from work, thoughts about his children, concerns regarding the relationship with his wife, struggles of travel through checkpoints, and his relationship with his brothers. Yoad reported feeling confused about the purpose of these details. She understood their literal meaning, but often found herself effectively discombobulated, wondering what he needed from her. She also came to feel suffocated, in her words. She reported feeling frustrated, as though Amjad had escaped from previous silences into speaking so much that no room was left, even for breathing. As such, she often had the feeling of the room being heavy with thoughts and words that were left unsaid, though they were very much present. In this, she reflected how both silence and speech can be defensive, used to fill up the space, but never reaching the depths of the patient or the clinician. While Yoad was committed to and engaged in intensive self-reflection of the work, she reported that her Israeli supervisor often downplayed her approach and considered her psychoanalytic work with Amjad as a great success, because Amjad had become comfortable with her. Her supervisor dismissed concerns about Yoad's countertransference and was not curious about Yoad's feeling that Amjad was making a lot of noise with no depth. Yoad was especially concerned as the ball in his throat lightened as he spoke, but immediately returned and grew whenever the session ended. She felt that she and Amjad were playing a game of negotiation, and yet, in reality, there was no solution. Yoad often was confronted with conflicts regarding how to speak about the work with Amjad in supervision. She noted the psychoanalytic importance of having associated to negotiations, especially in the context of Palestine, while she understood intuitively that associations had meaning, especially in the countertransference. Yoad found herself at a loss of how to express this concern to her supervisor, especially as the supervisor did not share Yoad's concerns. Amjad himself was happy that he did not feel any discomfort in his throat during the sessions. However, he stated that outside the clinic, his painful feelings returned, and he was unable to get rid of the ball. Amjad's wife became very worried about him and began pressuring him to explain what kind of treatment he was getting. When Yoad asked him about what he had told his wife about the treatment, he replied he had not disclosed to her that he was seeing a woman psychotherapist, because she would not understand. Rather, he told his wife that a pulmonary doctor was following up on his case, and this doctor was teaching him how to breathe better. Yoad noted that this was an important turning point in the treatment, as it opened up a space for her to ask him about breathing in real time without being bogged down only by talking. More specifically, Yoad indicated that with this opening in the material, she had asked him to put aside the distracting papers and talk about his difficulty in breathing, with specific focus on when he was feeling suffocated. While he did not answer her directly, Yoad shared that he was smiling in his silence, and she felt it was important to self-disclose in service of the clinical process. Specifically, she shared with him that she sometimes felt suffocated in sessions because of over-talking that seemed to leave little, if any, room for anything else. She recalled that he had smiled again and indicated that, as his feeling of suffocation increases, it turns into a ball in his throat that suffocates him. In subsequent sessions, Yoad worked with Amjad to uncover and recount all the moments in which he had felt suffocated. When his wife reminded him of payments for the pathetic car he had bought. When he passed in front of his closed house in the West Bank. When his Israeli boss asked him to bring him fresh olive oil from their tree in the West Bank. When he entered the area controlled by the PA, his own country, and he read the sign, "No crossing border, dangerous area." In every session after that pivotal moment, Amjad talked about the specifics of his breathing difficulties and sighed a lot as he did so. He shared with Yoad that he could not cry because he felt it was not manly, but continued to feel pain in his throat. Yoad recounted that, at this point, her supervisor indicated abruptly that it was time for Yoad to terminate Amjad's treatment, because she was happy with the achievement that he had made and felt there was no further growth or depth to explore. Yoad remembered feeling very upset about this decision, though she did not feel she had the power to do otherwise. Following her supervisor's suggestion, she told Amjad that they needed to move to termination. Yoad recalled, "Here, something happens, something that I did not expect." Amjad erupts. She recounted how Amjad exploded, shouting in a way that she could have never previously imagined. While shouting at her, Amjad told her she is weak and that she is not the one who owns the decision or the decision-making process. He continued to shout at Yoad, accusing her of not really being concerned with taking care of and protecting sick people. Yoad remembers being shocked by the fact that he was screaming, and that she did not fully understand what was happening in the moment, nor did she have the space to reflect fully about her countertransference, but that she knew internally she felt very happy. After this moment, Yoad made the decision to continue Amjad's treatment alone, without consulting her supervisor any further. While in future sessions they did not explicitly talk about Amjad's outburst, she noted she had started to feel that he had become taller, as if his stature had gotten bigger. During this phase of treatment, Amjad started talking about anger. More specifically, he spoke about getting angry inside his car, the lousy car in which he crossed Kalandia checkpoint twice a day, once on his way to work and once on his way back. Amjad reported getting angry in his car whenever he read the word Mahbar, checkpoint crossing, on a sign. He reported feeling anger because he did not feel like he was just crossing from one area to another. Rather, he felt that he was inside one space but was prohibited from free movement in another while standing at a checkpoint. "Why do they call it a crossing?" Yoad recalls him asking her angrily. "This is a checkpoint, a checkpoint, a checkpoint!" In a session soon after he began to uncover his anger, Yoad reminded him that they had not spoken about the ball in his throat for quite some time now, inquiring where it was and if it remained a symptom for him. She recalled Amjad stating, "Sometimes I feel that there is hate or hatefulness in my throat and not a ball in my throat." This is when she decided to ask him who he hated, to which he responded, "I hate myself." After a moment of silence, Yoad recalled Amjad opening up about an incident that had happened 2 years prior. He reported taking his 7-year-old daughter in the morning with him on his way to work, as she had wanted to meet with a friend in Jerusalem. He remembered that his daughter was very happy that morning, as she had been fantasizing about this magical day with her friend for quite some time. He recalled that she wore a beautiful new dress the night before out of excitement and put flowers in her hair the morning they set out. Amjad further shared that his daughter was singing throughout the trip in the car, "Bouncy, bouncy, bouncy ball, bouncy, bouncy over the wall." When they reached Kalandia checkpoint, Amjad was surprised to see tear gas and a confrontation between the occupation army and stone-throwing protesters. Worried about his daughter, he tried to reverse, but his car was stuck in the midst of hundreds of cars, all trapped, motionless. The situation was increasingly frightful for a quarter of an hour, after which it completely calmed down, but the soldiers closed the checkpoint and prevented the cars from moving. Amjad recalled that his daughter had begun to cry uncontrollably during this time, and that he was hugging her the entire time, trying to calm her and contain her fear. Eventually, she told her father she needed to use the bathroom. Amjad was not convinced that they would be allowed to access a bathroom, but nevertheless got out of his car to inquire, as his daughter's crying was escalating, and he could tell she was in a considerable discomfort. Amjad told Yoad that he waved down a soldier, telling him, "My daughter needs a bathroom." Instead of responding to him, the soldiers ran towards him with their weapons raised. He relayed to Yoad, "I raised my hands toward the sky and shouted at them, 'She wants a bathroom. Please let me pass.' The officer in charge shouted, 'Get back in your car. Get back. Get in the car. Tell your daughter to piss herself in the car.' All the while, his daughter continued to cry. 'Baba, Baba, I need a bathroom.' Amjad recalled getting back in his car, hugging his daughter, and with a trembling voice telling her, 'Do it here, Baba. Do it quietly here, in the car.' He remembered how at that moment, his daughter's screaming stopped as the smell of urine spread in his car. Amjad looked at his daughter and found her shedding silent tears. He hugged her as he drove them home, and as he looked at the checkpoint gate, he remembered the cheerful song of his daughter at the beginning of the day, "Bouncy, bouncy over the wall. We are not you, Taba," after which he immediately felt a ball stuck in his throat. Yoad remembered how Amjad finished describing the incident and witnessed tears flowing down his cheeks for the first time. She remembered tears rolling down her own cheeks as well, as she also became aware of "a wheel in my throat" as they ended the session with shy smiles.
The moment when Amjad exploded with anger at Yoad with regards to the system in which they're actually having to be obliged under, which then inspired Yoad to continue the treatment outside of the existing structures. It just made me think of the fact how an individual deals with guilt and shame in a confrontation with truth. And these moments, these really crucial moments of choice, because Yoad could have decided to just follow the orders and say, well, you know, it is what it is, and I feel for you, but there's nothing I can do. But to make that leap in spite of what is being told as the right thing to do, whatever that means, but to perhaps even do the incorrect thing, the inappropriate thing, not following orders.
Right.
Would you say not? That's an individual choice, and that perhaps is what makes a character out of a person. That choice at the end.
That choice by Yoad was liberatory, and there's no way around it for a multitude of reasons. But let me contextualize it further. And this is the way that it gets wrapped up in these ideological positions that Stephen was saying earlier about legibility, and even what you were saying about quote unquote civilization or liberal humanist discourses, that if we had the exact same story and it was Yoad standing up to her husband and saying, I refuse, no one would have a problem with it. They'd be like, look at that strong Arab woman. You see, she got out of this demonized Arab patriarchy and made her position known. The way that it transforms so quickly, that when she actually insists on her self-determination, actually, I don't think it's an individual thing. It was in her alignment with a collective Palestinian liberation project that she understood what was happening in that moment as a necessary form of life sustenance for Amjad. And this is where her own honesty, the truth-telling, the recognition in that moment, even about how she might have been conscripted, we falter. We get seduced. We believe in the sanctity of these structures as though they are natural constructs, rather than what we talk about in the book about all these ways in which psychoanalysis in the conditions of oppression, and in this particular case settler colonialism, are actually constructed to keep indigenous people in their place. In that moment when Amjad blows up at her, she hears the truth in what he's saying, and she's reminded. He takes her into reality testing. Now, a white liberal feminist reading of that might be horrified that a man is yelling. I'm not condoning that, but Yoad did not get stuck there. She realized he was telling the truth, because what he says in that moment to her is, you are not the holder of the decision, and you actually don't care about sick people. And in that situation, he was right. He was right. She was being imperious. Because of the own constrictions of her supervision under settler colonial surveillance, she was being imperious and thinking she knew what was best for him. That's, for me as a clinician, that's the point where if we're thinking about anti-oppressive technique, if we're thinking about liberatory technique, it's to be able also to humble ourselves in those moments and be agile to read how certain signifiers might shift under different conditions. This was not an issue of gender in that particular thing. And I'm not saying this as me deciding that. It was Yoad telling me that. That was not the most important thing for her there. What was important was a catapulting back into the reality of a Palestinian and into the reality of the supervisor, supervisee, patient triad that did not have an equal distribution of power, neither in the context of the clinical treatment or in the material reality of two Palestinians and the Israeli supervisor. But I do think that the crux is this collective liberatory space that she was able to connect to.
Lara brings in this parallax of when gender and other positionalities, the intensity waxes and wanes. And I just want to say that what Amjad was also doing is that, I love what Lara just said now, something like jacked Yoad out of a particular positionality of her effectively being an agent of settler colonialism. And the supervising analyst thought that repair had been reached. Everything's okay. The symptom is gone. He's fine. Go back, cog, to your place in the settler colonial machine. You know, your boss needs olive oil, so go get it for him. And his quote-unquote outburst, we talked about anger before, wrenched her into a particular consciousness of being Palestinian. It wrenched her out of a moment where she was being conscripted. And because of power that works through rewards and punishments, she was acting along those lines. She actually had told him, we are now discontinuing. So it's his refusal. It's his refusal to accept a form of repair that was not there, that let her see and reach a particular form of awareness of her role in that system of false repair, in which that also then instigated her own refusal. In many ways, she then was replicating Amjad as a Palestinian.
Can I ask you guys about the epigraph? I translated it, I don't know if it translates right, that says, I felt sad and nostalgic. And where is this quote from?
Where's the quote? Wow.
When I translate it's from Yabalar and Ruthla.
In the epilogue?
No, in the epigraph.
Oh, in the.
Oh, at the very beginning.
In the very beginning.
At the very beginning.
Okay, I was wondering. I was like, all right.
Excuse me.
So what was the line you were talking about?
What's this quote from?
Oh, is it the dedication that we make in Arabic?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's toward.
Oh, okay. It's not sorry. That's where we were a little.
Yeah, we thought you were talking about the epilogue. Sorry.
Oh,
we heard
sorry.
yeah, no.
The dedication.
That is. So what is the Arabic?
It's not a quote. It's us. And it says.
So yeah, do you want to? It's نحو تحرير فلسطين والثورة العربية. You can translate it.
Toward the liberation of Palestine and a pan-Arab revolution.
There's a chapter about being trained in language. Could you speak more about what it's like to be polylinguistic and the issue of language together with psychoanalysis?
I think the entry point is thank you for. No one's ever asked us what that meant.
No,
right?
that's right.
Like non-Arab speakers.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that, and it's interesting because I think people have asked us why is this written in English and not Arabic, and it is being translated in Arabic. It's also just got translated into Farsi. It's being translated into Spanish and to French so far.
But when someone asks us why do we write it in English, we have to say, well, we did write it part of it in Arabic.
But
Let's
actually,
say that next time.
actually, that's the fun part is that there's something really important about what you're teasing out already, like just by highlighting why is this the only thing that we wrote in Arabic? And I think there's the book, in addition to being, if I may say so myself, an extremely well-researched academic book, is also a political intervention. Because for us, they're inseparable. I would say that it's written in English because it's the English-speaking audience that most urgently needed to read it. We are emerging, both of us are in the United States, we're both academics in the United States, and I, myself as a clinician and a psychoanalytically oriented clinician, believe that folks in the English-speaking world need to read this and need to have access to it. And that was a decision, obviously, and both of us, we work in English. That is what happens when you're colonized people. And when English is the global language, you end up having to perform it better than your counterparts. And then there's also a way in which it actually goes to show that the folks in our book are not the people who are confused. And this is the point, the Fanonian angle, is that Palestinians in this book that we worked alongside and whose stories were honored to platform and uplift are not the people who are confused about this. So the language becomes the conduit of communicating, again, to go back to our conversation, what's already known. What emerged through this book is something that our Palestinian comrades and colleagues, this is the discussion that's happening, is not happening in the global north in the context of psychoanalysis. The fact that this is written in Arabic and how you pick that out is because that is what our political commitment to Arabness, to the Arab world,
and Arab speakers.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is like disrupts the coloniality of knowledge too. Like not everything is everybody's to know. Just because you can, I say this all the time to my students and my supervisees, is that there's a way in which, and this goes back to your point about the imperiousness of mental health, is like people's interiority is not ours for the taking just because our method allows us to do that. So putting that in Arabic for me actually is like the political commitment that this book is about Palestine and it's for the liberation of Palestine, but it is also in alignment with the larger freedom and liberation and self-determination of the Arab world from empire. the fight of which runs through Jerusalem and through Palestine. And that had to be in Arabic.
I don't ever really think about audience. I think about, unfortunately, the languages in which we dwell. As a third-generation Arab American, English is the language in which I dwell. But it's important also, I think you allude to this, also like the conversations that we had in Palestine were largely in Arabic.
Yes.
And this is not because our friends and interlocutors didn't speak English. Many of them did. And if they didn't speak English, they speak another language that we could probably communicate in, French or something like that. But our conversations could only have been in Arabic to create this book, which also means why there are a number of words and terms in this book that are untranslatable. And in which, and this is how we also have to understand language, when you are a bicultural, bilingual person, you also do understand where the overlap exists in those Venn diagrams. What words are untranslatable and what words aren't. By the way, it goes the other way too. I mean, a number of our conversations were peppered with words like, object relational, or identifications or something like that, So I thank you for the question so much. Again, I think we all got kind of confused at first because you're the first person out of a number of different discussions we've had with people to pick up on the Arabic, and I really appreciate it.
How I noticed the book, whilst it's not a book for the Arab-speaking world or even French or any other language, but in English, not necessarily it is addressed to the imperialist system itself, but those who needed to hear this as a reminder from the system within. That's a takeaway that I get also from Fanon, that there are already the discussion that is happening, but how does one approach somebody who forgot that they know? And this is very much what I take away from your book, and also back with the confusion and what you're referring to regarding to the epilogue. I really appreciate the title, Resistance Keeps Us Sane. And I think here, it's not that sanity is not going to be discovered within psychoanalysis or any other treatments per se, but I had this little anecdote. I met a woman at the panel discussion, and prior to the discussion, she was telling me about some of her life aspects and so forth. But prior to it, she pretexted with a reassurance that definitely she's not depressed. I'm definitely not depressed. And there's this feeling of, and I'm thinking like, you don't have to explain to me like who's not depressed today, like what kind of insanity would you... But then as I politely ignored that pretext and gave space, and then she kind of got more and more riled up. And then afterwards she came in, she thanked me to say, I really felt enlivened by our conversation. And I want to say the same thing to you both, that especially some of these stories that was shared, it might sound like a downer, but actually I feel enlivened by the ability to discuss and to share these issues that would have otherwise been perhaps even taboo for people, that there's a kind of fear or like, it's like, I don't want to get into this complicated matter that has nothing to do with me. I've got enough problems that I need to repress and present a normalcy. Whereas I'd imagine that if you are in Palestine or in other points of contention and difficulty, that there's no fooling anybody of your problems, but it's those who are in this docile fear within a system that is telling you that if we only work a bit harder, salvation will come and we will avoid the eschaton. I think that's the madness, and that's the part that I think those are the people that actually needs to hear the message that your book is bringing. So I really thank you both for that.
Thank you so much for really picking out on something incredibly important, which is not only the false promises of repair and the idea that repair is actually a promise for perpetual violence and pain and not a remediation of it, but also the fact that just because we live in worlds structured by violence doesn't mean that we don't create worlds of beauty and life. Obviously, what this book is about and what our friends have taught us is that how do people live these lives of joy in conditions of, quite frankly, unimaginable horror. Like when you go to Palestine and you look at the wall and you see it is a prison wall that is really high, really big, meters high. When you have to go from point A to point B, and we're talking kilometers, and you have to be subjected to checkpoints. And even if you can go through as a non-Palestinian so easily to watch other people being subjected to that violence as a daily condition, when you walk around Jerusalem, the old city, and you see it's saturated with military, saturated. And the way that military harass institutional police brutality, harass people from old ladies, selling vegetables to kids to whomever. It's horrifying. But then you also realize, then you hang out with Palestinians and they're having fun. How is it that you forge these lives of beauty and life in these horrifying conditions? And it's at that intersection that we feel analysis comes through, and the analysis of what will create new worlds. That is the generative meeting point between that violence and the resistance to succumb to it. And that can be exported to a number of different conditions, whether you're talking about Black joy or whatever in the United States.
Just to say that I find it so moving what you said. What could be considered a downer actually felt enlivening to you. You get it. And that's very moving to me. It's moving to me. You don't have to be Palestinian to understand and see the logic of oppression, and also to see beyond it, because that is also a fixture of our world, that people can be only understood through their victimization, and to then either we need to save people or see them constantly as suffering rather than the fullness of their being that's not mediated by this oppressive force that was not of their choosing. And I think so for you to feel life is precisely, I think, what undergirds this book. The acknowledgements start with this, I did it. This book began from revolutionary love. And I think it is a love letter to Palestine, to the Arab world, but also to everybody who's in solidarity and who can recognize and feel and understand when this falls on you and you get it in ways that may have not been knowable before, but that immediately make sense. That's it too. Thank you for platforming these voices and for saying, you know what, this does have to do with me. And fuck everything else that says it doesn't.
Are you still in despair about the world?
I never have been in despair about the world. I'm enraged.
Enraged, all right.
But I don't think I'm in despair. I can't afford despair. I can't tell my nephew, my niece. You can't tell the children there's no hope.
I suppose I'm wondering whether we're more materialistic, more selfish.
I don't know more.
No.
I think we're more panic-stricken. I walk through these cities, the cities of the Western world, London, New York, and sometimes it resembles the most poverty-stricken cities of the East. There's been a breakdown, a betrayal of the social contract in Western life. And people are grabbing for things and holding on to what they think they can get and stepping all over their neighbors because they are panic-stricken.
What, comforting themselves with material things?
Yes, but when people do that, they are reacting to something is beginning to crack. People hoard all this because they don't have anything else, but they don't really believe in it, and they kill to get it. But that proves the moral bankruptcy, which translates itself into the actual bankruptcy of the world in which we live. We have yet to understand that if I am starving, you are in danger. When people think that my danger makes them safe, they're in trouble.
أنا بحلم إنه أشوف أمي وأكل خبز. وده حلمي. أنا بحلم إنه كل الأسرى المحبوسين يطلعوا من السجن. أنا شعبان أسمع صوت ستي وأكل خبز ونخرج إن شاء الله أنا بحلم إني أكل حصان. أنا بحلم أكل شاورما وأرجع أشوف حصان بالسواق. أنا بحلم يرجع أبوي. أنا بحلم أكل ساندويتش كلام. أنا بحلم أكل شاورما. أنا بحلم أكل سكر. أنا بحلم إنه يرجع أبوي مع المكان. أنا بحلم إنه يرجع المخيم في المكان. أنا بحلم يفتح الطريق. أنا بحلم يفتح الطريق معي. أنا بحلم إنه يرجع أبوي يعيش. أنا بحلم إنه أبوي يرجع يعيش. أنا مشتاق له.
Why should a black man in America care about what's going on in these other places and we're still fighting for a lot of civil liberties?
Because it's not an either-or claim. I got that too. That's why are you over in Palestine all the time?
It makes sense. I understand why people would say that.
Do something for black people.
If black people are so effed up here, why fight somebody else's fight?
Right, and I guess, one, I think we can walk and chew gum, right? Like, I can fight for black people here and struggle abroad. But again, there's a relationship between the two. The New York City police, they're killing us. But they're being trained by Israeli security forces. So Israeli police, yes! They're being trained, or New York City police and in other cities as well. So there's a connection between the two. Malcolm X cared about this issue. Malcolm X is my hero. So when Malcolm X cared about this issue, when he wrote a piece on this in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic, I cared in the fall of '64. I cared because Malcolm cared. Malcolm, everybody here, go back and listen to Message to the Grassroots. When Malcolm is talking about what a revolution looks like. And he was talking about us being connected globally. Right? That's why I care about this issue. The Black Panthers cared about this issue. SNCC cared about this issue in summer of '67. There's a lot of people, black freedom fighters who we admire. People say, be like Malcolm, be like Assad. People want to march and be like Huey. People want to be like Angela. They all cared about Palestine.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias, and agenda to control exactly what people think. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Together and struggle, not alone.